Hello, Jeff Zwerink here. Welcome back to Science Faith Connection, the segment of our show where we look at important scientific and philosophical issues and see how they relate to the truth of Christianity. Today I'm joined by my friend and colleague Kenneth Samples, and we're going to be talking about the kind of world that needs to exist for science to work. Ken, good to have you here today.
Hi, Jeff.
Nobody doubts the efficacy of science. I mean, you can study and understand so much stuff that's going on in our world. But it does strike me that science needs a particular kind of world. And these are things that are not necessarily studyable by science, if you will, but that are required. I know you've written quite a bit about that. So I just kind of want to throw the question open to you. What are the sorts of things that need to be true for science to work?
Yeah, I think it's important. You know, science has certain assumptions, starting points, if you will. They assume that there's a real world out there. Hindus don't necessarily agree with that. Mm-hmm. They believe that there are patterns and regularity that they'll find. So an experiment on Tuesday won't contradict an experiment on Friday, that it will operate the same way. The scientist has to believe that their cognitive faculties and their sensory organs are pretty reliable and that they can trust things like mathematics and logic, that there are true representation of what exists. So those are things that scientists assume as they begin the scientific process.
So, I mean, there's part of that when I hear that. I mean, I agree, yeah, those things need to be true, but there's also kind of a, well, duh, of course it's that way type response I have to that. Right. I mean, we look at the world and it looks that way, so why wouldn't we just say that is the given, that's where we start? What's important? Why is that important to draw that distinction or point that out? Well,
many worldviews don't make those assumptions. Hinduism, for example, there are elements within Hinduism that would say the universe is God's body, or the universe is an illusion. If the world is a brute reality, let's say we adopt naturalism, why should mathematics necessarily work? Why shouldn't we just assume a chaotic system rather than one that is consistent? So not every worldview can justify those assumptions of science.
So if I get what's going on there, you can look throughout the history of the world and even in today's world and say there are ways of looking at the world that wouldn't permit science to work.
That's right.
And there's an aspect to where, at least in the West, we live in a society where those assumptions or those starting points are grounded in our worldview. So in some sense, it seems obvious because of the worldview. What would you say to someone who's like a Buddhist or a Hindu who says, yeah, I agree that science works? What's the issue there? Why is that a problem?
Well, I think everybody would agree, but if you adopt kind of an enlightened scientific view of the East, their worldview isn't consistent with the idea that the world is mathematical or the world can be understood in terms of logic and reason. I think I would say this, Jeff, that there's a lot of beliefs in other worldviews that make science, that are incompatible with science. I like to say you need three things. You need the right kind of world, you need the right kind of people or scientists, and you need some kind of rational congruence between the two, the network, if you will. Many of the worldviews don't have those readily networked ideas.
Seems like if if you were to take science apart from the West, I mean, we don't get to live in the world where the scientific enterprise doesn't work because that's where we are right now. It does seem to me that a society will inevitably move towards its worldview. So if a worldview doesn't have the presuppositions that science requires, does that likely mean that science will just kind of fade out? Or what do you think would happen in that sort of worldview?
Well, I think in one sense, if we look at history and we ask, when did science begin? How did it begin? Well, 17th century, there is the scientific revolution. The historical context is Christian Europe. If we look in history, the ancient world, Chinese made contributions to math and science. Gunpowder, they had, there were engaged in their thinking. The Greeks and the Romans, even Babylon, even the Muslim civilization made contribution, but it was never able to actually come together, let alone flourish. And I think one of the reasons why it didn't come into being in earlier centuries is they lack the philosophical framework to justify it.
When you look at the science-faith discussion, at least in the West over the last few decades, if you will, kind of naturalism and Christianity have been the two opponents there, if you will.
Yeah.
One of your statements that needs to be true for science to work is that we need to trust our faculties. And
Yeah.
I'm just reminded of a conversation. We were talking about this, the argument from reason, and you were explaining you need to trust your faculties, and if that doesn't work, science won't work. And I go, well, duh. I mean, science just works.
Right.
Why do we need to worry about that? That one seems to be one that's harder to grasp. Why is that such an important issue?
Well, I think to do science, we have to be able to trust our cognitive faculties and sensory organs. So my brain mind has to be able to give me truth about the world. I have to be able to measure. I have to be able to weigh. I have to be able to analyze. If my mind doesn't give me true beliefs about reality, I don't think science could ever begin. If I adopt a naturalistic worldview where there's no mind behind the universe, it's the product of a blind mechanistic accident, if you will, why should I necessarily trust a brain that evolved by accidental processes? In a theistic framework, if God has an infinite mind, he creates creatures with finite minds. There is a greater sense that I can trust that. So I think naturalism has a real hard time explaining human rationality, and human rationality is a core principle of science.
But isn't even in the process of science, there's you make an idea, you go out and test it against the real world. Why is it seems to me that science kind of has a built-in way of determining whether what we're seeing is correct or not. So why is it, and that seems to be built into science rather than a presupposition of science, or rather something science can test. How would you respond to that rebuttal?
Well, I think scientists does kind of confirm every single day, hey, we can trust math. Hey, we can trust that there are these laws of physics that are reliable. But to do science, you have to first accept that. That is, these are not things we've learned from nature. These are principles of our worldview. These are principles of reality. If they weren't true, we couldn't be able to do that. But they are assumptions upon which science is built. They're not derived from science itself. I mean, how could we conceivably know that all parts of the universe are regular, that have patterns? We operate with that assumption.
It almost seems like this is not to be snarky, but if you're going to do science, you have to act like the world described by Christianity is correct. Doesn't mean you need to be a Christian, but you kind of have to act like it.
I think that's right. I think in many respects, Jeff, science is the product of Christian capital, if you will. And because it's been a few centuries away from its origin, a lot of scientists are unaware of both the philosophical and historical connection to Christianity.
Well, thanks, Ken. I really appreciate your comments.
Sure.
Science clearly has the ability to help us understand how this world works. And yet when we dig in and ask the question, what needs to be true for science to work, we find that Christianity is one of the, if not the only worldview that anchors all of those necessary assumptions. I'd encourage you to go to reasons.org and check out Ken's blog on this. It's called What Kind of World is Needed for Science to Work? It helps you understand what those assumptions are, how Christianity grounds them, and how we can use that important reality to tell others about who God is.